Hey, welcome to this lesson which is about player pawns. In this lesson, we're going to lay the foundation to our player pawn by creating its blueprint class and setting up its components. We'll learn how to adjust cameras with spring arms, and we'll also wrap up this lesson by replacing the root component. So let's begin creating a player. Naturally, you might want to say player character, but we're going to have a physics sphere as our player. It's not so much a traditional humanoid character. So character is not the correct term for us here. In Unreal, what we are trying to create is known as a player pawn. A player pawn is an extension of the blueprint actor class we used in the previous lesson. And looking at the Unreal documentation, it tells us that the pawn class is the base class of all actors that can be controlled by players or AI. And it also tells us that a pawn is the physical representation of a player or AI entity within the world. So what this is telling us is that the pawn class can be used for our player. Great, so this is what we want to use. So where do we get started with creating our player pawn? First, let's come inside our blueprints folder, and let's right click here to create a new asset. We're going to create a new blueprint class, and just beneath actor we see pawn, and it says a pawn is an actor that can be possessed and receive input from a controller. So there's two new terms here that we haven't seen before. The first is possessed and the second is controller. We will start breaking these down as we move forwards with this class, but for now I'm just going to select pawn and I'm just going to name it BP underscore player pawn. I'm just going to double click on it to open it up, and I'm going to dock it next to my level. And right now I have a challenge for you. I want you to add components to your player pawn. I want you to add a static mesh component, a camera spring arm component, and for your final one, I want you to add a camera component. So try adding these, and don't worry if you're a bit unsure, because in a few moments I'm going to take you through the steps to do this. So pause the video here, and then when you're ready, come back and hit resume. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can do this. We've just got our default scene root, our root components here. Now let's add in a new static mesh component. We'll hit add component and then select static mesh. Now we can name this something here. I'm just going to name this mesh, and I want to assign a sphere to the mesh slot. So one way I can do this is by coming over to the static mesh slot. I can drop down where it says none, and I can look through the different shapes here, or I can just type and search for sphere because we want it to be a sphere. I'm going to choose the shape sphere here. Okay, so we've got our sphere, and now we want to have a camera that tracks the player, and we can add cameras directly in as components, but first we want to add a camera spring arm that we can attach a camera onto, and this makes it much easier for adjusting the camera for us. So to do this, we can come up to add components again, and we can scroll down a bit till we get to the camera section. We can see there's a camera here, but there's also the spring arm. So let's go ahead and just select the spring arm. We don't have to name it anything. I'm just going to deselect it. And now I can just go ahead and add the camera. So I'll come up to add component and then scroll down again and choose the camera. And now let's take a look at our component hierarchy. I don't have to name this camera anything as well, so I'm just going to deselect that. So we've got the default scene root. We can see this little arrow here expanding it. So all the components we've added are now a child of the default scene root. We can see we have the mesh that also has an arrow, and we can see that the spring arm is a child of the mesh. So if I close this down, we can see that the camera is separated. So the camera isn't actually a child of the mesh yet, but the spring arm is. When we select the spring arm, we see this red line coming out showing us the length of the spring arm. Let me just move this up so we can see this. Now we want the camera just here in the viewport we see, we want this to be on the end of the spring arm. So how can we do this? Well, we want the camera to be a child of the spring arm. To do this, to make the camera a child of the spring arm, we can just click and drag it up onto the spring arm. We can see the camera's moved. If we select the spring arm, we can see the camera's not actually on the end of the spring arm there. So how can we reset the camera to the end of the spring arm? Well, we can select the camera, and then on the details panel where we have the transform for the camera, we can reset its location by hitting this yellow arrow button just here, which sets its relative location to 0, 0, 0. Now let's select the spring arm, and like I said before, the spring arm is going to give us greater control over the camera, specifically how we place it around our sphere. On the details panel, we have this target arm length, and when we adjust this, it's going to change the length of the spring arm, but because we have the camera attached to the spring arm, it changes the location of the camera. The same goes when we rotate the spring arm. The camera moves with the spring arm, giving us the effect that we are rotating the camera around our sphere. And looking at root components again, we know that a root component is needed. We currently have the default scene root as our root component. But what I haven't mentioned is that root components can actually be changed. So we can get rid of the default scene root and just have our mesh as the root component. To make the mesh the root component and to delete the default scene root, all we need to do is drag and drop the mesh component onto the default scene root, and here it says drop here to make mesh the new root. The default root will be deleted. So when we do this, it deletes the default scene root, and we now have our sphere mesh as the root component. Great, so I'm just going to finish up here by hitting compile and save. In the next lesson, we're going to be learning more about controllers, input, and possession. Hey, welcome to this lesson, which is controllers and possession. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at player controllers, and we're also going to find out what it means to possess a pawn. So in the previous lesson, when we created our player pawn, we briefly saw the terms possessed and controller. In this lesson, we're going to start breaking these terms down to understand what they mean and to understand how Unreal handles players. Specifically, what allows a player to control a pawn. So we have our player pawn blueprint in the content browser. Of course, it doesn't do much right now as we haven't done any blueprints programming for it. However, we did add in a mesh component and also the camera components for it in the previous lesson. Now, what do we want to do with the player pawn? Well, really, when we play our game, we want to play the game as our player pawn. We want to be able to press the play button on this toolbar and have the viewpoint of the player and to be able to send input to it so we can control it. So what happens if we press play now? Well, we just spawn in as the default player pawn that we saw in section 1. We're not playing as the player pawn that we created, we're playing as the default one that Unreal spawns in when we play the game. Well, I'm just going to hit escape. We have our player pawn in the content browser. What happens if we drag this out into the world and now hit play? Well, it still doesn't work. We're still controlling this default pawn. We're not controlling or having the viewpoint of our player pawn. So why is this? We have the player pawn sitting here, but we can't control it. How do we go about controlling it when we play the game? How do we be it? Well, this is where controllers and possession come into play. Every player in Unreal has a player controller. Now, I don't expect you to understand what a player controller is yet, but we're going to start exploring this together. Notice that in my level, in my world outliner, I have 18 actors. And keep an eye on this. When I hit play, I now have 30 actors in my level. With the viewport focused, you can press Shift F1 to bring the mouse back, and you can start scrolling down the world outliner to see the list of your actors. And notice that you'll have some actors that are listed in yellow here. Yellow actors in the world outliner mean that they have been spawned in by the engine at runtime. These haven't been manually placed by us in the viewport before we hit play. Okay, so we have a bunch of different actors that are spawned in when we hit play, and notice that one of them here is actually a player controller. If we scroll all the way up to the top, I also have an AI controller here. So there's two different types of controllers, an AI controller and a player controller. Now don't think of these controllers as Xbox or PlayStation controllers. Think of these instead as an invisible actor that exists in the world for each player playing your game. In the controller section of the Unreal Engine documentation, it tells us that controllers are non-physical actors that can possess a pawn to control its actions. And we know this is true because when we press play, we have controllers in our level that we can't see, so they are non-physical. The documentation also tells us that a player controller is used by human players to control pawns, while an AI controller implements the artificial intelligence for pawns they control. So we have two different controllers mentioned here, player controllers and AI controllers, both of which we've just seen in the world outliner. And on the documentation, we have subcategories for each of these controllers. Let's just take a brief look at the player controller. This tells us that a player controller is the interface between the pawn and the human player controlling it. The player controller essentially represents the human player's will. Okay, so let's try to make sense of all of this. Unreal has AI controllers and player controllers. Every player has a player controller. As we've seen in the documentation, a player controller represents the player's will. As an example, if I am a player, my player controller tells Unreal which pawn I control. It tells Unreal which pawn listens to my input. And how does it do it? Well, a player controller does this through possession. Player controllers allow players to possess and unpossess pawns, and this really means it allows players to take control or stop controlling a pawn. And a final important thing to note is that a player can only possess one pawn at a time. So what we really want to do when we play the game is we want to possess this pawn that we have in the level. So how do we do this? Well, there's different ways we can do it. I'm just going to show you one way for now. We can select the pawn, and then on the details panel we have a pawn category, and under here we have auto possess player. And this tells us when we hover over it, it says determines which player controller should automatically possess the pawn when the level starts. So this is definitely what we want to use. We can drop this down where it says disabled, and we can choose a player. Now we're creating a single player game here, not a local multiplayer game, so we're just going to select player 0. And now when we hit play, we have possessed our player pawn, or really our player controller has possessed the player pawn. And we now have a different camera view. We are viewing the world through the player pawn's camera. Remember that we added in a camera component to the Blueprint class, and we can now think of this as the player camera. Now our camera is a bit close to our sphere here, so right now I have a challenge for you. I want you to adjust your player camera, but be careful when I say this. I'm going to drop you a hint here. Do you want to adjust the camera component, or do you want to adjust the spring arm component? I just want you to adjust your camera view so it's a bit more zoomed out and we can see more of the world. So pause the video here and have a good go at it, then when you're ready, come back and hit resume. So to do this, I'm going to switch over to my player pawn blueprint, and I don't want to change the position of the camera itself. Instead, I'm going to select the spring arm component, and I'm going to use the target arm length to adjust the location of the camera. If we make this a larger value, it's going to make the camera more zoomed out. And I'm just going to use a value of about 1400 here, so around 14 meters. And then we can switch to rotation mode if we want to, and we can make it look a bit more down onto the sphere if we want it to look like that. So I'm just going to hit compile and save and close the blueprint, and now when I hit play we can see that we're more zoomed out and we look down onto the sphere. Now if you remember, when we looked through the world outliner when we hit play, we had an AI controller here as well, but we no longer have that. So why is that? Well, at first we weren't possessing this pawn. If we were to drag in another one and hit play, we will now have an AI controller. If we were to drag in one more, we would have two AI controllers. And the reason for this is because we are not possessing these two, and by default, if it's a pawn, Unreal will spawn an AI controller if it's not going to be possessed by a player. And the difference between us controlling this pawn over these two is the fact that we're possessing this pawn here. Now I'm just going to hit stop. I'm going to delete these two extra pawns we've added, and we're going to end this lesson here. Just make sure you've saved your current level by hitting the Save Currents button on the toolbar. And in the next lesson, we're going to be taking a brief look at game modes. So when you're ready, I'll see you in the next lesson.